Just picked up the new Wired, and it's all about attention environmentalists, keep your SUV, forget organics. And one lead item they had in there went right to the heart of this topic, which was carbon trading doesn't work. They say that of all of the carbon offset projects that have ever been done under Kyoto, it only delays by 6.5 days the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted. So what do you guys think, just starting off? Do you think the idea of trading carbon is a solution for anything?
Do you want me to start?
Yes.
So I've never been in any situation where so many people make the perfect the enemy of the good, or the good the enemy of the perfect, however you want to think about it. That's like saying skipping dessert won't make your whole diet work. Well, true. Maybe it's only going to delay you getting fat by, X number of weeks. But if you do that, plus a whole lot of other stuff, you have a solution. And that's just consistently the rap against carbon markets, is that they don't work. They do work. They're not the perfect solution. I loved Elon's thing right there about do 100 things 1% better.
Right.
Carbon markets are one of them.
If you look at the carbon market today, you got to go back and you look at 6.6 billion people on the planet today, and we're short of water, we're short of food, we're short of electric capability. And we're going to move to 9 billion people in just 40 short years, or 2050. So what's it going to look like there? The bottom line is we've got to do something, and carbon is the culprit. It's been categorized as the major culprit of the greenhouse gases. And if you look back in 1850s, we had the parts per million of carbon was 283. Today it's 383. And if we do nothing, it's going to go to 450 to 500. And you got to depend on, that depends on where the tipping point is. We don't know where the tipping point is, 450 or 500, but we're already seeing polar ice melts. We're seeing people like that are being displaced, like Kivela in Alaska. They're called climate refugees. The climate refugees is a new term where people are being displaced from their domain because of the rising sea levels. So we have a problem. So are we going to trade carbon and mitigate the problem, or what are we going to do? What is it going to take for us to be compliant with our planet?
Yep. I just wanted to drill a little bit more on that, though. I think as we talked on the phone before, and we heard last night, everyone sort of believes that this carbon trading system is a fait accompli. The first question is, does carbon trading work to reduce carbon at all? So let's talk just a little bit more about that. Another knock on carbon trading is that the projects that are invested in, there's no real guarantee of the return, and the whole certification process. Is it really beneficial to pay someone in China to not emit refrigeration gases for a year, and then you bank the credits on that for 5 years, but then a year later they restart it? Or you pay to plant a tree in Brazil, and you assume it's going to have a 40-year life and suck up carbon for 40 years. 2 years later they have a revolution, they cut the tree down, and the carbon that was supposedly created by that trade, the sequestration value of those trades is diminished. What can we do in that area? I know TerraPass is working on developing some more verification systems.
Yeah, well, I mean, so it's a lot of different questions. A lot of this comes down to what project types you're talking about. So let me talk about a specific kind of project, and then we can kind of use that as a jumping off point. So one of the things that we do, we sell carbon offsets to consumers and small businesses. We take that money, and then we turn around and we go to farms, and we tend to do all US projects, but there's other people who do it in other parts of the world. And what we'll do is we'll go to a farm, usually a dairy farm, where there's a lot of cow manure, and you've got methane just venting straight into the atmosphere out of the manure. And what we'll go in, we'll make a contract to buy the carbon credits so that we can resell them afterwards. And that helps the farmer be able to finance the installation of an anaerobic digester, which allows them to capture that methane and make electricity from it, electricity which then is used to power the farm. So that's one of those situations where literally you have the day before the digester goes in, there's methane just venting straight into the atmosphere. It's about 23 times as powerful as carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. The day after the digester comes online, assuming all is well, now that methane is being used to create electricity to use the farm, which means A, the methane's not going to the atmosphere anymore, B, the farm's not drawing off the grid anymore.
Right.
And so you look at something like that and say, explain to me again how that's not a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, because it simply is. Now, we then will take the credit, and I mean, we're a business. We try to sell it for more than we paid for it and make some money at it. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we fail. You know, you try that. That's just being a business. You try to do that every day. There's all kinds of examples of other offset types that have different kind of risk in them. So in the farm thing, if a tornado comes through and blows up the digester, well, clearly the methane's venting up into the sky again. So you got to go build the thing again. That's sort of true of lots of different kinds of offsets, but I don't think it's a reason to stop trying.
To stop trying. Okay.
We have to do something, and there's no silver bullet, so there's a tremendous amount of initiatives out there. One of the initiatives we have is with a product called AcceleGrow-M, and it's a plant growth fertilizer accelerant, and we create a tremendous amount of biomass by taking a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and we're sequestering it in the ground, and by doing that, we're producing a lot of tremendous yield improvements on all sorts of crops, especially in drought conditions. So we're able to look at this, and the view that we have is to give it to the small stakeholder farmers in the world. There's 450 million stakeholders, small farmers with 3 hectares or below that are in trouble today. They can't afford fertilizer, they can't afford the farm equipment and so forth. So we're going to give this product to them so that they can grow food, and then we'll sequester a tremendous amount of carbon, and we'll be able to monetize that, get that money back into the microfinance system and give it back to the local villages where they can then loan money to the farmers to buy more seed and fertilizer.
And so for your business, to your point, if we have a carbon trading market that values that carbon, then your business makes sense. Without a carbon trading system, this business doesn't make sense. You know, installing anaerobic digesters, you don't have the financing engine to do that without the carbon trading system, right?
No, that's just it. And the main qualification for something to actually qualify for a carbon credit is by definition, the project doesn't work without the money from the carbon. Otherwise, what's the point?
That's
so
true.
We have to look at that the Green Exchange was just formed in March of this year. They're going for regulatory compliance by the end of this year. It's going to be the largest commodity exchange on the market trading greenhouse gases. So the people like Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs and the banks of the world that are investing in this, they think there's going to be a carbon market. I believe there is going to be a carbon market, so it's already in place. If we do a cap and trade system in the United States, which we think is going to happen by the year 2012, sometime between now and then, is some type of cap and trade will make a market in the United States worth $1 trillion. Globally, the market is worth over $3 trillion. So there is going to be trading of carbon taking place, and last year it was $60 billion trades.
That's true, but you know, if you look at what happened in the European carbon market, they had a giant crash because everybody, you know, sandbagged their numbers under Kyoto. The numbers came in a lot lower. The value of carbon went in, you know, in the tank, you know, it's going to be a market that's going to be incredibly volatile. So let's talk drill down a little bit more on what kind of cap and trade we could or should drive for as people in this room. Do you think there is any substantial difference between the major proposals out there in their effectiveness as a cap and trade system, like the Lieberman versus the others? Do you have any opinion of which one we should call our senators in support? Or any cap and trade system, it's all good?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know if it's worth getting into sort of the arcana of it. I would make one point, which is I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just because of the water we all swim around in. You know, cap and trade has become synonymous with a carbon market, and it's become synonymous with money and people making money. You know, the first part of cap and trade, the cap part, is the important part. That's the part that actually takes greenhouse gas emissions down over time. So from my point of view, I'll just say any cap and trade system that actually has a good hard ratchet down
Right.
on greenhouse gas emissions over time, and 60% in 2050, 80% off in 2050. Come on, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's not like any of these guys are going to be in office then. But the design of the system, the trading part of it, is definitely important, and you've got a lot of debates in there.
So let's talk specifically then, drill down more on the cap. Where should we put the cap? I was reading a very interesting piece over the weekend on the difference between load side and generation side caps. And one study estimated in California, if you did a load side cap versus a generation side cap, the load side cap would cost you about $5 billion less. And the difference is load side is you go to the people who are selling electricity and the marketers of electricity, and you say, 20% of your load has to be renewable, or the total emissions of carbon of your entire load has to go down in this way, in which case they can manage the portfolio of technologies in that load to do it. If you do it on the generation side, then what it ends up being is a carbon tax. So if you're a coal-fired power plant, you have to reduce the emissions of that specific generator versus being able to look at a portfolio. So that the cost of the cap on the generators ends up being $5 billion more than the cost of capping at the load side. Should we care whether we end up with a load or generation side cap, or economically, does it drive anything differently?
I think the generation side cap is punitive to us, in that if you do utilities, they're going to pass those costs on to us, whatever the cost is. So there's a big debate that's going to go on with that. It's really to be determined. I think a cap and trade at this point has to be flexible enough to allow people to invest in the technologies and get a viewpoint of where they're headed, instead of command and control. For instance, command and control says, here's the technology, you go out and you buy it, and it's very punitive. It's like running a car at 60 miles an hour, and all of a sudden there's a roadblock that's put up and you can't react to it. The cap and trade allows you to have some reaction time as you move down through this, and it becomes more punitive if you haven't done it later on in the game. The problem is we're running out of time, and the most costly thing we can do is nothing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I would just, to the point, there's a sort of a slightly different way of thinking about it, which is simply, should you have your cap put down at where the carbon's extracted from the ground, basically all the way down to source, or should it be all the way out at the other end where it's emitted? And you're going to see, and I sort of have a travel background, so I can see this one coming. You're going to see one of the fights of all time in the airline industry over this.
Yes.
Right? Are these guys going to have to pay their carbon price in the increased cost of jet fuel, or are they going to have to pay it on the fact that they're the guys burning the jet fuel? And what's going to happen is the environmentalists are going to say both, and the airlines are going to say neither. And it's going to be pretty interesting to watch.
It's going to be a big fight. So where the cap gets put is still undetermined, and it'll make a difference as to how the market works. Then if you have a cap, there's this difference between allocation versus auction. Can you guys explain what the difference of that is between, if you have a cap, how do you then, what's the difference between allocation and auction of the limits?
Sure. So first, when you're starting off a cap and trade system, what you need to do is make sure that everybody starts with effectively a permit to put as much CO2 or greenhouse gas into the air as you are currently doing. And so you can either give all those permits away and say, okay, that's year one, and then we're going to bring it down, let's say 5 or 10% a year, depending on industry sector. And that's where the economic pain comes in if you can't hit those ratchets down. Or you can say, well, actually, those of you who are already putting a lot of GHGs into the air, we want to get you to pay right now for that permit. And that's what an auction system looks like. I guess, a lot of people look at the auction side of it and say it raises a ton of money that you can then funnel into pure R&D on the government side, which is sort of a good thing. The other thing it does is it means that companies that have been going out of their way over the last, X number of years to get greener and greener and greener and get their emissions down, well, they kind of win in that scenario because they have to buy far fewer permits than the folks who just kept on pumping the emissions up. Of course, the counter side is that, well, if you auction and you're talking about baseload power generation, for example, now you've basically got a lot of utilities who are having to pay enormous amounts of money in an auction, and the only way they can get the money back is just pass it right onto the rate base.
Right.
That hits consumers. So
Right.
my prediction, given the conference we're at, is you'll probably see an auction system with some giant exceptions.
Giant exceptions. Okay.
The allocation system is a lot better, I think, because it allows people time to react. It allows them to invest in the technology or look at new technology being generated in order to invest in that and put it in place. Otherwise, it's going to be extremely punitive to go out on an auction system.
Yeah.
It's going to cost a lot of money, and it is going to be passed on to us. Exactly right.
Yeah. So let's talk about what might happen with the proceeds of that auction. And, you know, Elon said we should have a carbon tax. What do you think is the relationship between a tax and a cap and trade system? Is it either or? A lot of people argue that we should have a tax instead of a cap and trade system. Some say we should have them both. Do you have any opinions? I certainly have one.
Well, to be flip about it, I would say just throw it all at the problem and see what sticks. But I guess, you know, my opinion really is that if you're going to follow the science and you're going to try to get emissions down directly and you don't have a lot of time, you have to go with a cap. You just have to. And, you know, the little economist in me, not that I'm an economist, but sort of says, sort of carbon tax feels like a more elegant solution, the price signal and so forth. We don't have time for price signals to work their way through the system. We need to cap stuff and start ratcheting it down and let the price work itself out over time. Once you hit equilibrium, maybe a tax is the right way to go. Maybe some sectors should have a tax and others should be capped. But I just don't think that putting a tax on in the short run, and say the 5-year time frame, I just don't see it working.
I don't see it working economically. I also don't see it, the cash from that going to any good. The idea of giving the government money to then go solve this versus giving the, allowing that money to be reinvested into projects like yours and yours by the free market because of the opportunity created, I think is a very different thing. I don't know if you guys remember that the federal government tried to solve the fuel problem once already under Carter and created a federal corporation, funded it with $5 billion of our taxpayer dollars, and hired a CEO and went out and paid a bunch of R&D and said, we're going to solve the oil dependency problem in the 70s. All $5 billion of that was pissed away by the bureaucracy in DC. And one part, because of the way that money allocation works there, one of the problems they had in that company was that they had to allocate the $5 billion equally among the 50 states. Because that's what the political system leads you to, is that kind of investment. And of course, that didn't lead to investment that followed the right kind of technologies or ideas. It lent to more government pork. So let's move a little bit into carbon offset technologies.
But can I just debate, because I mean, maybe big government's not the best thing in the world, but if you could take a bunch of that money and recycling it into funding something like the production tax credit on solar installation, it's not a bad thing, right? And the government's kind of the only entity that can do that.
Right. I would put down my lot in the side of things like the PTC, which, using tax policy to incent in a big way the kind of behavior that you want the free market to do, versus saying in a command and control way, we are the government and we're going to solve it.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I recently was running Imperium Renewables, which was the largest biodiesel producer in the country. We actually started the company here. I said things 2 years ago that were really nasty about the oil companies. Hillary Clinton came to our refinery in Seattle and announced a giant new federal program. In fact, she wanted to propose a new federal agency for renewables to solve the problem. And its primary job was to hand out $15 billion to research universities to continue to study the problem. And that was really painful for me to sit there and listen to her say that, because that was sort of the old way of solving this problem. Let's collect some federal tax dollars, hand it out to universities. I think more interesting way is things like the production tax credit, things like a carbon cap and trade system that encourages the market to do the right thing. With government enforcement, you have to have that as well.
And let's go back and look at the United States as a preeminent country in the world that's familiar with cap and trade. With the 1990 Clean Air Act, I mean, we've rolled that out. We've mitigated lead emissions as well. It's the same thing with NOx and SOx. They're totally different. So there's different mechanisms that you have to look at. So we do know what a cap and trade system is, and we're going to take the failures of what's happening in Europe right now with the problems of a very punitive system that they have, and say that may be not the right thing to do. So we're going to take our time and look at what a cap and trade system really does. And we do want to allow the cap and trade to allow for new technology to come about and not be so punitive that it runs people out of business or the costs are passed on to the public.
So before we get to a few more technology, I did want to talk to you a little bit more about who the bad guys are that we have to worry about in this thing. Everybody's sitting here going, you know, group hug, carbon cap and trade, but there are a lot of entrenched industries that don't want this to happen. What kind of behavior can we expect from them? And I'll just put up my example of first generation biodiesel companies and first generation ethanol. I will say that first generation efforts in biofuels have probably been lost to the oil companies. If you look at the economics of ethanol and the economics of biodiesel, the oil companies have won. They control the economics of that business, and there's not a lot of money to be made in those first generation technologies because the incumbents, the oil companies, set the price of ethanol. And they've squeezed the profits out of that and have not allowed anyone in that business to make money. What kind of behavior can we expect to see from these people to delay this thing? What kind of slowing down tactics can we expect?
I think you can look to California when they increased the CAFE standards tremendously last year, and all of a sudden they were rescinded or reduced because the car industry came forth and said we can't meet those standards. It's going to be very punitive. Mm-hmm. We're going to lose our competitive edge and so forth and so on. So California folded. Personal opinion, they folded and reduced the very stringent CAFE standards that they had, which I think was a mistake because the Alternative Fuels Council, which was begun in 1988 and 89, they had some very strict guidelines for California that were going to be in place by 1995, and those didn't happen because the car companies came back and said we can't meet those standards. And those are the types of things we're going to see in the industry, the fighting against this particular situation.
So, you know, I don't think there's I agree with that, but I don't think there's a simple villain in this. It's interesting. So, you know, we sell a lot to consumers, and so we end up with, I guess, a different flavor of press reaction to a lot of the things we do, and it's been very strange to me. So I come from this background where you're selling hotel rooms and airline tickets, and people don't tend to find that too controversial. And we found that selling carbon offsets, on the far left of the spectrum, you get environmentalists who stand up and say, that's just wrong. What you guys should be doing is encouraging people to reduce carbon emissions in their everyday life and get themselves down to zero. Never mind the fact that the vast majority of Americans can't possibly get anywhere close to zero because they live in the suburbs and all the rest of it, and even the infrastructure gives you a certain footprint every year. But still, and of course, you know, that gets a certain play in the press. And on the other side of it, I mean, I guess it goes without saying, there's an incredible number of vested interests who don't want to see cap and trade work. And the easiest way to make cap and trade not work is to show that credits don't work. Well, what looks like a credit right now? Oh, I know, an offset. Yeah. And so, you know, you end up with, it just comes from both sides, which is the strangest thing about it. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you sort of say, well, that's fine. You know, 10% of people are going to do the right thing, and I'll keep banging away at them. But it is very interesting to me that I don't think it's a black and white kind of thing where there's a hero and a villain. I think it's a thing where there's an incredible number of vested interests, where some of the interests really are on the side of the good. I mean, how can I say the Sierra Club's a bad thing? I can't say they're a villain. They sure don't like offsets, though. I sure would rather that everybody rode their bike everywhere.
They don't like offsets. They don't like biofuels because of the food for fuel debate.
But you can't call them a villain.
They're not a villain, but they're unfortunately a complicit actor that is encouraging the existing product. You know, in the oil case, for example, oil versus biofuels, they go, well, you know, we don't want to tear down the rainforest, so what's your option? We're going to keep burning dead dinosaurs. So those guys, unfortunately, a lot of the behavior I see in the oil industry and the electricity industry reminds me of the early days of the cigarette industry. The cigarette industry's first tool out of their bag in defense was, you know, it doesn't really cause, you know, cancer at all. They funded bad science. And it wasn't until last year that Exxon stopped funding the climate change denial studies.
And then they've moved on to offsets.
Now they move on to offsets. So their second solution, which I'm sure you've seen, is we're going to solve the problem. That's the same thing as cigarette companies did. Here's a low-tar cigarette. It's better for you. You know, BP's now beyond petroleum. Chevron's going to solve the problem. Shell's going to solve the problem for you. So, you know, we're here on the case. Take care of it. Don't worry about it. And then the third thing you're going to see, which I think is going to start, here's a prediction I'll make, by 2010, I believe that you'll see a class action lawsuit certified in the United States against a carbon emitter for the health effects of carbon. And that is in the end what brought down the tobacco industry. Was they finally lost in court, but they fought in court for, you know, 10 years before they lost. And it ended up being the states that drove that versus the federal government, the state attorney generals.
Yeah, you know, just one point on timelines is I think a lot of this is the reason that you're going to, a lot of people right now, and it came up in the other panel, are saying that, well, you know, everybody's for cap and trade legislation. Of course, something will get passed next year. The things we're talking about here are the reason that it may take a long time. It may take a really long time to get something through. Jerry Brown was at a conference I was at recently, Attorney General of California, former governor, and he said, look, it's the Mount Everest of legislation.
It is.
Nobody understands how hard this is going to be to get done. It's because there's so many interests in so many ways.
And to your point, Martin, there's already a lawsuit on Kivalina, Alaska against ExxonMobil for the disassociation or relocation of the 600 inhabitants that were affected by the increase in the sea level. So they've already sued ExxonMobil.
I think in the end there'll probably be lawsuits that bring it down.
Yeah.
So let's just peg, you mentioned methane digesters. Can you talk make one or two predictions about technologies you think are best for carbon offsets and the magnitude that they could?
Well, so yeah, sure. I mean, from our point of view, we focus almost completely on methane capture because it's 23 times.
Yes.
So basically, for anyone who doesn't know, there's a bunch of different greenhouse gases, and they've got different factors that are all done in terms of CO2 equivalents. CO2 is definitely the big problem. It's probably 85% of emissions in the U.S., but then methane is equivalent to roughly another 10%, and then you've got sulfur dioxide, or nitrous oxide, sorry, and then a bunch of HFC refrigerant gases. Basically, what you want to do is knock out all the high multiple gases first and just knock them all down, and then you start working on the huge block of CO2 that you have to work through. We're not in the business of doing the HFC refrigerants and stuff because we're U.S. only. And basically, the EPA says there's about 7,000 dairy farms that should be able to install a digester and get off the grid, and we're just banging away at that, and landfills, and we'll probably do coal bed methane as well, and that's kind of what we're doing. We support wind as well a bit, but mostly it's methane reduction.
In our product, the growth enhancement fertilizer at Accelgrow, 1 gallon, we treat 1 acre with 8 ounces of product. We excite the photosynthesis of the plant, so 1 gallon treats 12.5 acres. We generate enough caloric content to feed an additional 30 people for a year, and we sequester somewhere between 30 and 50 tons of carbon with that 1 gallon of Accelgrow. So if we're giving it to the 450 million stakeholders in the world, small farmers in the world, we're going to make a major impact on CO2. If you look at the predictions of what it's going to cost to mitigate the greenhouse gas effect, there are some people that say there's going to be $1 trillion a year, $20 trillion over the next 20 years. If we get 60 million gallons of Accelgrow on properties, then we can feed 1.8 billion additional people, which solves world hunger, and we can mitigate 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide, which is the amount in excess that we're emitting today. That's incredibly huge, and we can,
That's
we're
meaningful.
looking at the big picture. We are a rapid response company, and we're doing that in Africa now.
That's why you're the spotlight company. I think we have time for one or two questions. Back there?
So I think I have a rudimentary understanding of how algae blooms can work, because after you've captured the carbon, you sink it to the bottom of the ocean where it stays sequestered. In your case, when you build all the plant matter, some of it gets consumed, and so what's the sequestering process after you've grown all the plants?
We grow a tremendously large root system with our product. That product is then sequestered beneath the soil. That is going to be, we're actually looking at the process of going through a CDM, which is a clean development mechanism. We're in the process of filing for that for Africa. That allows us to certify that carbon dioxide is converted to carbon and then sequestered in the earth. It's third-party verified, so we know that it is a gold standard certifiable carbon sequestration agent.
Other questions? All right.
Can I ask you a question of the audience, since we've got 14 seconds left? How many people here bought a carbon offset for their flight to this conference, assuming you're not local? I see one here, I see two there. You are the winners of climate change chocolate bars.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.